Hi, I'm Bo Beatty, co-founder of Traffick Jam Live. Today we have the honor to talk with Josh Miller, Director of Partnerships for It's a Penalty and their fabulous Super Bowl campaign. Josh, thank you for joining us today. How are things going?
Thank you, Bo. And first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I just recently learned about Traffick Jam Live, and we're happy to be on here and chat with you today.
So Josh, before we talk about It's a Penalty and the Super Bowl campaign, what drew you to the human trafficking space?
Yeah, so I have two small children. I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old boys. And when my wife and I had our first child, that's a big responsibility when you have children and you start assessing, like you look at the world around you and the world we live in, and you start thinking how, I have to be responsible now to protect this child, and I had read a book by Christine Kane. And, she talked in there a little bit about her story, about her background, about how she started the A21 campaign and got into the anti-trafficking movement. And I remember one of the stories that really hit home for me. And she was talking about people that were brought over from country to country in containers, like on a container ship. And then they were found and they realized it was a human trafficking situation, and they took their passports and their IDs, and they were forcing them into either sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And I just thought, wow, that really happens in our world. Like it just really kind of hit me. And then I think being a father of a small child at the time, it just was something I was like, I have to get involved in helping to stop this. I just can't believe that this is happening in our modern day society.
We wanted to check it out. Here's the ad that they put in their Super Bowl campaign. Take a look and then we'll talk with Josh.
There's a darker side to one of America's biggest sporting events of the year, human trafficking.
An industry that sees an uptick during major events like the Super Bowl.
Law enforcement officials say the Super Bowl is a magnet for human traffickers.
Thank you so much for being here today and giving attention to such a worthwhile cause so that we could ensure that we are getting the word out about human trafficking.
It's critically important that people understand what this really is. I mean, this is all about awareness, and that's only done by education. And so we're going to do everything we can at every step of the way to let everybody know what's actually going on. This is slavery, no doubt about it, and we're going to do everything we can to stop it.
Throughout the month of January, It's a Penalty and A21 will be leading efforts to mobilize, educate, and raise awareness in the community of Tampa Bay leading to the Super Bowl.
We're working together with a large range of industries: the airlines, the airports, ride shares, the hotel and tourism industry, with the NFL, so we can educate the public, learn these signs to look out for, and be able to make a report.
Since joining It's a Penalty and battling human trafficking, we've seen this campaign reach almost 2 billion people globally.
When we ran the campaign in Miami last year, there was a 163% increase in calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. In addition, there were 47 arrests and 22 victims recovered. 4 of them were missing children. Part of our campaign involves a huge volunteer outreach. This year in Tampa, we're bringing together hundreds of volunteers to distribute It's a Penalty campaign materials to over 300 hotels and motels throughout the Tri-County area. We're also partnering with Uber to provide a virtual training to their drivers, as well as supply rear-view hang tags with the National Human Trafficking Hotline for all of their vehicles.
It's through partnerships with the community, partnerships with the private sector, the public sector, the government, that we can make sure that our awareness is turning into action. We count on the community to join us in that action and to be a part of this solution.
Josh, here at Traffic Jam Live News, we have a special focus on teenagers and human trafficking, prevention, education, protection. How do you go about approaching teens in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great question. And my thoughts on it are that in working with middle and high school students and with teens specifically, sometimes it's a little bit difficult, as we know, being an adult, to connect with teens. But I think it's still important to get the message to them and help educate them. And then I think the next step really is to get them involved and to get them fired up about it and passionate about it. Because what happens is, if you can get these teens to realize that this is a horrible thing that's happening to other teens, either in their town or in their school, and they can actually stand up and make a stand. So one of the things we used to do in our presentations is not just educate on, be careful, look for signs, be aware, but also, especially with the boys too, this was really important, is to engage them to a point where we say to them, stand up and be a protector in your community. Learn how to stand up and how to protect the girls that are your friends, or even the other boys that are your friends. And I think that ties into, we'll talk in a little bit about our Super Bowl campaign, but I think that ties into these NFL players that are ambassadors, because they're really good examples of men of integrity who are standing up and making a stand.
That's a good point, Josh. And indeed, it does take men of integrity to make a difference in this space. And the challenges of reaching teenagers we've seen is very difficult. In fact, in an upcoming episode, we'll be speaking with Saving Jane, a program that is working with manga comic books as a way to deliver anti-human trafficking messaging into middle schools and high schoolers. And I've seen the video. They do engage in that content. It's a dynamite distribution mechanism.
Absolutely. No, I love that idea. And our partners who we work with, A21, are doing a similar thing. I know they're doing that specifically in Thailand with some of the comic books to reach some of the teens, and, really trying to reach them where they are. And, as you know, it's a really difficult subject to talk about. It's not something that people want to discuss or talk about. So if there are creative ways like a comic book or things that you can do, sports, that's one of the reasons we try to harness sports, is because it's a way to broach the subject and help people learn to stay safe, but not have it be such a depressing, thing to talk about all the time.
Josh, you make a really good point about meeting people where they are, on their level. It's not a PowerPoint presentation. It's face-to-face communication, peer-to-peer, shared concern. Now, let's talk about the It's a Penalty campaign.
So in London, our CEO, her name is Sarah Di Carvalho. She was based out of London, and her initial charity that she started many years ago was in Brazil. And they were working with street children in Brazil and trying to help them get out of poverty and get off the streets, and doing a lot of local work in Brazil with orphanages and that sort of thing. And one of the things she noticed is she just realized that, there was some human trafficking type situations going on amongst that. We know that whenever there's poverty, whenever there's vulnerabilities, whenever there's kids who are vulnerable, they become vulnerable to human trafficking, because there are people out there that are exploiting children. So what happened was, she met a young girl who she had a conversation with and realized that she was really in this desperate situation. And she asked her, would you do something to help us? Is there something that you could do to help us? Because this girl basically said to her, I think it's too late for me, but if we can help these other girls, in my town or in my village. And our CEO just really was heartbroken over that. And, at the time in Brazil, they were getting ready to host FIFA's World Cup in Brazil in 2014. And so she just had this idea of, what if we were to get together and create an awareness campaign around that large sporting event, because she knew that there was going to be an influx of people into the city, there was going to be more activity, and it was really only going to make it worse for these young children on the street. So that's kind of how It's a Penalty started. And the first campaign was around the FIFA World Cup in 2014 in Brazil. And the campaign ended up being sort of the model that was used to move forward. And Brazil thought it was such a great idea and it made such a great impact that they asked us if we would come back for the Rio Olympics, which were going to be hosted in Rio. So we ran the campaign again for the Rio Olympics. And one of the things about It's a Penalty that I think is really important to note is that, we say that we're harnessing the power of sport to prevent abuse, exploitation, and human trafficking. And one of the really important components to that is that the Brazilian government, when we first got started, mentioned that fear is a deterrent. So if there's a way that you can, they said if there was a way you could build a campaign to sort of speak to not only the prevention, to people to look for signs and to be aware of what's happening, but to speak to offenders and say, look, we're not going to tolerate you in our town. You're going to be prosecuted. They found that a lot of these people that sort of get involved and wrapped up in human trafficking from the buyer side, a lot of times it's an opportunistic thing. They're in a city, they're celebrating a sporting event, they get wrapped up into it, and they're opportunists, And so if you can use fear as a deterrent to help them realize that this city or this town is not going to tolerate this type of sex buying, then that's something that really helped magnify the campaign.
All right, Josh, I'm really curious. How did you connect with Liam Neeson and his impact with It's a Penalty and your anti-trafficking campaigns?
Regarding Liam Neeson, our CEO had this idea a few years ago, and she said, there's so many people around that still do not fully know what human trafficking is. Many people still have a misconception. They've seen the movie Taken, they've seen that franchise of movies, and they still have this thing in their mind that trafficking is a kidnapping situation and people are dragged across borders and it's this big dramatic situation. And while that can happen, and we do know that can happen, it's a very rare portion of human trafficking cases. And we know that most human trafficking happens in your own city, in your own town, and often it's by people you know. So we thought, who better to speak to this than Liam Neeson, who everybody recognizes. He was part of the Taken franchise. So we thought we have to try to get a hold of Liam Neeson, So for years, we went through different avenues trying to get a hold of Liam Neeson, and our CEO finally made a personal connection with him. He learned about our campaign. He was interested in helping us. He is an ambassador for UNICEF as well, and he wanted to really get the message out there. And he told us, he said, look, I want to do this for you. I want this message to get out far and wide. And so he was on board to do it.
I love it. Again, in your recent interview with Ben Cooley in Hope for Justice, you had asked him to share a good story. So I'd like to ask you the same. Do you have a good story to share in the battle against human trafficking?
Sure, absolutely. I'd love to share a good story. In fact, we just got done, like you mentioned, with our campaign ahead of Super Bowl 55. And the campaign really is an all-encompassing campaign where we work together closely with the airlines, the airport, the ride share companies like Uber. We work with Airbnb, the hotel and tourism industry. And so one of the things that we do is a very collaborative volunteer outreach day. And so this year in Tampa Bay, we came together as one team with several anti-trafficking organizations, It's a Penalty, A21, and hundreds of volunteers came together. Hundreds of volunteers learned about the organizations. They learned about the truth about trafficking. They wanted to get involved. They were excited. And so in doing this outreach that was to hotels and motels, as well as convenience stores, we have now reported that 16 missing children have been recovered and identified through that campaign. And so those are the kind of stories that really make us excited about the campaign. Just recently in Tampa, one of the missing girls was found at a hotel. And so when we engage the community, when we engage these frontline workers, really the hotel and tourism industry and the rideshare drivers, to look out for these missing kids during the campaign, to look out for these signs, and to see missing children recovered is just absolutely amazing.
Again, congratulations, Josh. That's what it's all about. Collaborative effort, team effort, working together. It's a huge issue, and hardly anyone knows what's going on right in their own backyards here in the United States. And one of our campaign slogans here is join in. Let's jam human trafficking together. Thank you, Josh. Take care.